This podcast was originally recorded for DevChat TV.
Hey everybody, welcome to another podcast, another episode of Sustain Our Software. Today we have a very short panelist. It's just me today, Eric Berry, and I would like to introduce our amazing guest today, Heath Arensen. Now, Heath is the Director of Business Planning and Sustainability in the Digital Impact Alliance Open Source Center. He also is supporting open source projects with consulting and advising in business models for sustainability. Welcome, Heath.
Thanks, Eric.
This episode is sponsored by GitLab Commit. GitLab's inaugural user event brings together the GitLab community to connect, learn, and inspire. Speakers will showcase the power of DevOps in action through strategy and technology decisions, lessons learned, behind-the-scenes looks at the development lifecycle, and more. Learn how to innovate the future of software development by registering today. GitLab Commit Brooklyn, September 17th, and GitLab Commit London, October 9th. You can find it at devchat.tv/GitLab Commit.
Sustainability is something that's become quite the buzzword, and everybody kind of sees it a little bit differently. And I think our hope, kind of bringing some different perspective, kind of from the international development field, and some projects that don't necessarily kind of come down the main open source train tracks, might give us some interesting perspective of a different way that we're looking at the same problems of sustainability and how we might be able to kind of share some interesting learnings that we found.
I love it. When I was internet stalking you before the podcast, I found on your Twitter a quote that you have in your profile, which is belief that the world's best software can be built in the most unlikely places. I thought, what a fantastic quote.
Yeah, I've used that for a number of years. Well, a bit of background on myself. I grew up in East Africa, and most of my career has been in Middle East Africa. And kind of being in the world of startups, being in the world of technology, traveling broadly, and everywhere I go, meeting incredibly smart people. And you go to like the furthest corner of the world, and you'd be like, oh my God, there are some really smart people here. And in our technology community, that's super true. I think we have a gift for those who are like the first digital generation who've been able to kind of like live online, and that we've been able to have a global community, right? Like the internet has allowed people from all over the world to kind of like connect in. And so when you go to kind of far off places, you'll find quite a few people who've had that digital window into the rest of the world and are, spectacular smart people. Yeah, about 15 years ago, I built an offshore team for a digital agency out of Boston. And in that process, just got to meet some, outstanding, wonderful, super smart people. Spent quite a few years running that offshore team. And now in my role with the Digital Impact Alliance with the UN, I have that ability to look and see, what's happening with open source in countries, across Africa. What's happening in technology in these countries? What's the process of digital? Behind all of that is always people, really smart, really great people. So yeah, just had this, ongoing argument that, no matter where you are, there's really smart people. There's people behind your software. I think even in sustainability, that's what we got to remember, is that there's people behind it, right? It's not just software. If we're in these different, geographic locations and we say, how do we make great software? How do we sustain great software? Well, you need great people. And where are those great people? Well, we can go into that a little bit more, but there are often kind of prejudices and a history in international development of assuming that you need a certain skill set, and that certain skill set only exists in specific geographies, and often overlook the talent that is, right underneath us, and not taking, the appropriate steps to kind of, bring that talent kind of into the playground. So yeah, those are some issues that I think about and I care about a lot.
You've said a lot here, and first I got to say thank you for bringing this to light. In a previous podcast, we spoke with I believe it was Samson Gadi and Vipul Gupta about what it's like to be a developer and open source sustainer out of, I believe, South Africa. That was one that I wasn't on, but I was very excited to hear it. What do you hear from those developers in these areas? Do they feel like they're unheard or forgotten?
Yeah, I think it'll definitely be a both, right? So digital does allow us all to come and play. And when you are invited to the playground, it feels great. We meet people who have been able to, I hate to say it, like come from the village, become a software engineer, and then just connect into the world and have just this really real and rich kind of career that was digitally enabled. So that's on one side. At the other side, there remains, a level of perceived prejudice and exclusion in a lot of different kind of areas of diversity. And, in my work life, the Digital Impact Alliance, we've put, inclusivity and everybody being able to participate really kind of at the center of our own kind of, missional kind of commitments. And location is one of those. Where you live, where you're from, in addition to gender and sexual orientation, et cetera, which are all very kind of important things to pay attention to.
So all of these memories are flooding back to me when we spoke out at a Sustain Summit last year, and I remember being fascinated by you, by your efforts in trying to build up. And correct me if I'm wrong, but when we spoke last time, you were trying to build up teams or developer teams in these remote areas and help them build companies and help them kind of become sustainable themselves. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I think prior to my previous role, that was my kind of full-time thing. I've owned and continue to own a software company with offices in Nairobi and in Amman, Jordan. But in in very real and tangible ways in our work, maybe we should take a step back and and talk about the types of projects that we're trying to support. We can go into more detail in a second.
I am wondering, when you work with developers in these areas, do they view the problems differently? Meaning, when they think of what to build, do they look at more of the local problems that they're trying to solve? The things that they think about, I mean, are they building stuff like time trackers and that stuff, or are they more interested in building solutions? And the reason I ask this is, me being a privileged white male in Utah, I view software development in a very specific way of entrepreneurship and how can I make an impact in this crazy economy that we live in, whereas perhaps those that are in South Africa or wherever they might be in all those parts, maybe they view things a little bit differently. And when they're thinking about how they can use their talents to make an impact, perhaps it's not building those tools that, might go out to the mass market. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think that it's a lot of things all at the same time and a little bit more extreme, right? So when I think anybody who's spent, significant time with developers in Africa are like, oh my God, you guys have so many ideas, right? And they're things that you'd never think about. They're locally context specific. They're solving problems that are right there at hand. Like, you go out for, coffee or a beer, like the ideas just flow and flow and flow. And they're great. They're outstanding, right? But then we spin back over to sustainability. And yes, a privileged white male in Utah probably has some extra capacity and time and money to be able to devote some of that extra time to pursuing these ideas, right? And so the issue of, hey, I just want a job, I need some money, I need to kind of pay my bills, support my family, is a very, very real reality. And I think we need to kind of, when we're looking at talent and how do we unlock this great talent, both as developers and also as the generators of ideas that can be world-changing, you have to take care of that feed the family thing first, or at least always kind of be aware of it. And that's one of the challenges I think that we have in the great history of volunteerism within open source is how do you then balance it with the need to take care of your own personal needs? And I think a lot of the kind of things we're thinking through are trying to always balance those two things, right? How do you unlock that inner creativity and support it, maybe through a startup, etc. And how do you make sure that people have security, job security, not just for money, but also for career progression?
You present a very interesting question, and I'm going to turn that back on you. You've obviously thought a lot about this. How do you find that balance, and how do you enable the financial growth, and how do you become sustainable in this environment?
Yeah, I think another interesting thing to kind of think about and bring up is the difference between a person as an individual and a person as part of a community or as part of a team. And when you're an individual, you've got to kind of balance all those things themselves. I mean, in the world of open source, we do have the stories of the guy in the garage, right? They're one person stories. That's not really scalable in most contexts, right? Like it's very hard to do a one person software company or a one person startup, right? You got to do things in community. And so when we start to look at things in terms of teams and how teams can kind of do things together, then I think you can begin to unlock a lot more. So you could, I mean, it's simple things like, having a 10 or 20% time to work on your own things, but you have a job, right? So there's some other ideas that we've, played around with where developers come in and work on open source projects, and you take care of that paycheck thing by giving it like you absolutely have a guaranteed income, right? But then finding channels to then be able to bring out the creative and then plug it into something. There's ways that we can structure and try to do that.
Let's talk a little bit about we'll talk a lot about the Digital Impact Alliance. Is that geared to solve these issues?
Yeah, so the Digital Impact Alliance is housed at the UN Foundation, and it was conceived fairly recently based on some challenges of the international donors, those who give big money to try to solve global problems. And for many years, I'd say 10, 15, maybe even 20 years, they have loved the idea of open source in their technology investments. They've seen technology very much as first a pathway towards solving social problems, but now even more, it's seen as integral. Like it needs to be kind of baked into everything. And so these big international, let's call them bureaucracies, those who move big piles of money to across the world to solve big social problems, they need technology. They fund technology. They make recommendations to national governments on technology. And the thing that I think they latched onto early about open source was it's shareable and it's free. Let's give an example. If you're gonna fund let's say a healthcare statistics website in the country of Malawi, and that will cost about $3 million to put in that system. So you go and you put in the system. You're like, great, we did that. Success. Now what? Okay, we have 150 other countries who want that same system. All right, so what are we going to do? Are we going to spend $3 million every time? Or are we going to take that one thing and share it across the different countries, right? So I think conceptually, that vision is simple to understand. It makes sense. And I don't think anybody will say, oh, that's a bad idea. So the problem is that hasn't happened. And it hasn't happened for a number of different reasons. So there's a lot of kind of fragmentation in how the money is given and who it is given to, right? So you might even have this challenge where 10 different funding organizations identified that the country of Malawi needed a data statistics program. And very much in the world of startups, they all paid $3 million to several different companies who all built a similar system and launched them at the same time, right? Like startups have this problem, like they spent all this money and they launched it, like, oh my God, there's a whole bunch of startups doing the same thing. It's really embarrassing if it's in the social sector and we're all kind of building something for the same thing. And so we definitely tell those stories all the time. Like you wouldn't believe, and sometimes it's like in the same town, in the same city, the same things are being funded. And so the Digital Impact Alliance was set up to, at least the software division that I work in, was set up to kind of solve those problems, right? So to create some coordination, so like we at least know what we're all doing, to kind of create some common frameworks, saying like, hey, this is how we want to do it. So we're doing some work in what we're calling, building blocks of technology. If we can use reusable code, even cross-sector, we'll be a lot better off. And then just, supporting the projects that are already there. And that ends up being a big part of my job. And when we think about sustainability, it's a lot more for us than just the software. We have to think a lot. So in this Malawi example, now the software is there. Okay, here's the reality. It was built by a company based in Washington, D.C. They used independent contractors who, as soon as the project were done, they were off to their next project. So now we have a major system that's been deployed halfway across the world, which, if we're honest, even though it has the open source label and it's open source, it's just custom software. And it's custom software who the people who built it are not around anymore. And it's been given to a country. And maybe they do, maybe they don't have the internal capabilities and capacity to be able to support that. So you take that and then you multiply that by 100 and 1,000, and you start to see, how big this problem really is. And so we're looking at things as open source, but we're looking at them a bit differently.
That's absolutely fascinating. It's such a novel idea to open source these infrastructural technologies to be able to share. But when you think of that, what if I was one of those developers out of DC that built that software and I felt like, wow, I made a great impact. But at the end of the day, once those developers pull out and once the people behind that pull out, where do they go from here? So I imagine being in this role, you probably have some standards or some rules for contribution or rules for the code itself that they have to follow. Does that exist?
Yeah, but it's not consistent. So that creating of rules and the other things kind of related to it, and we call it Open-Sourcifying things.
Okay.
And so, and you've heard the term open source and name only. Well, I guess there's two parts of that. There's the open source and name only because you're like nefarious and you want to keep control. But there's the other side of it, which we see much more often, is open source and name it only because nobody bothered to license the code and put it on GitHub, right? That's what we see a lot more of. There's not much nefariousness. So that actually is the primary service that the Open Source Center within the Digital Impact Alliance plays, is that we first work with the donors who have funded a project, and we say, okay, where's the project that you have funded? Okay, there it is. Now where is it at? Like, is it really open source? Can other people use it? Is there? So we have these like mini grants that we give. We call it like for the like dirty jobs, right? So documenting, making sure that there's deployable builds, making sure that the right licenses are in place, IP, etc. Huge one is identifying the appropriate fiscal home. That's ended up being a very large and very interesting kind of process for a lot of these projects. But the belief that we have is that if we can actually open sourcify them, like truly make them open source and begin to build a community, and kind of doing that in two ways. One is really kind of focusing on what local implementers might look like, a network of implementers for the software that would build up local capacity in that particular country and solve some of these, human resource challenges. But at the same time, focusing on that will be able to be that base for a community that will then come and support the project. I think our sustainability challenges are that while there's a lot of money flowing into this from the international donors, so like there's money in on one side, there's not a lot of real value for a community, like let's say a corporate community or a community of cloud providers or, any community. Like there's no real strength there for those communities to come in and say, hey, we want to support this, right? So, we can't easily send these guys over to the Linux Foundation and, have a whole bunch of people sign up for their foundation. They're not going to be excited for that. Our challenges are a little bit different.
Why do you think that challenge exists?
Which one?
Well, the challenge of people getting on board, the tech sector getting on board of this.
Yeah. So let me clarify. When it comes to excitement, people are excited. Like if we give a presentation at a conference, it's super interesting. Like we're solving really cool problems, especially kind of for the volunteer developer community. For them to be able to plug in and participate on these projects, outstanding. Like that's not a problem. The challenge is that, let's look at how our software is a little bit different, right? So I think we kind of try to break down different types of open source projects in different ways. And, a lot of people have done that. I think we like Mozilla's archetypes a lot, and they have quite a few of them. But to really kind of simplify, I think, the two main ones that we kind of look at is like, let's say an open source project that's, let's just say, in the middle of the stack, right? Software above it, software below it, somewhere in the middle. Like there's dependencies each way. Projects like that have a lot of dependencies, and those who are dependent on it, they're motivated to come in and to support it. But it's all kind of in the software world and the code world. And then let's say, here's another class of open source projects. And these are, let's call them the end-to-end solutions, right? So there's the WordPresses, the Sugar CRMs, Odoo, et cetera, right? So they're complete end-to-end software solutions, but they're open source, right? So in that category, the types of people who would kind of build businesses on top of that tend to be, consultants and hosting companies, et cetera. Our projects are they are all entirely in that second category. They're end-to-end software solutions. And so then you would say, well, you have to be kind of, at a certain scale, you can begin to motivate, small consulting firms to, take this kind of core and build a practice off of it. But there has to be sufficient promise of consulting revenue kind of coming their direction to do that. And in our world, that's sometimes true. That's very often not true. And where it's not true is where we're trying to, make it true. Get to a scale where there is a sufficient opportunity for small private sector players to come in and participate.
And that's part of the goal of the Digital Impact Alliance.
The Open Source Center within the Alliance, yeah, that's very, our dream is to see these projects be healthy, sustainable, and just, solving, global social problems. Like that's what we want to see. And we do that through, the first is, having a very broad network, just getting everybody to kind of talk to each other, right? So to reduce the duplication. We do that by working with the donors, those who give money. So there's a policy element. Like here's a good example, and we're starting to see some positive changes in this way. So if a government, let's just make up a country and put them in a rich country in a part of the world, has a lot of money that they're giving to another country somewhere else in the world, and that wealthier country has a whole bunch of strings attached to that $3 million grant that they've given. And one of those might be that those who build and implement the software, those who receive that contract, must be from the rich country. So they win the contract, they build it. It would be much more appropriate. And the reason for that is because it ultimately comes back to taxpayer dollars. And it comes back to an earlier world of development where we were primarily sending stuff, right? So it's not unreasonable if you want to send tractors to Mozambique and the American government is paying for those tractors. It is reasonable that they would buy John Deere tractors rather than Komatsu's or it is reasonable to argue at that level. But when it comes into digital services, that same precedent has kind of carried through. But that becomes very, very problematic for the ongoing ability for a country locally to support and build their own software. So a very simple thing that we can begin to advocate to the donors is that there be some kind of, in the old words, technology transfer, or there would be something written in that requires the use of local implementers to be able to participate in the project. A second thing is to look at the entire life cycle of the software. I think the challenge that we see is things are very much seen as projects that fit into very kind of tight timelines. Like we're going to say, like, imagine you build this $3 million, software plus implementation at a national level and you launch it. Then all of a sudden sustainability becomes like, well, who pays for the support? Like who pays next year? Who pays when it breaks? Who pays for new modules? And like there's a facility in that, but these are big funding cycles with big gaps in between. You're like, okay, we got to fund next year's, and so these are some big challenges that we see. And I think that what we feel very strongly is that if we're able to take this software, build very strong and robust and traditional open source communities around them that care about this software and sustain it, that will make it easier. There still will need to be places where the international donors put some money in for something, because these are big projects that need a lot of stuff done. But the healthier that the community is, the better it will be sustained.
That's fascinating. I didn't realize that that's how money's spent in the tech world. It's very logical to think that the products and solutions should be built where they're going to be used and maintained. That's quite a challenge that you have against you. Do you have any stories or cases of success? I'd love to hear something that this organization has done that has already been implemented, or at least in the process of being implemented. I'd love to hear the story of success.
Yeah. So to be clear, we're only about a year and a half old, and let's come back in a year. We're going to have 5 or 6 pretty cool ones.
Fantastic.
We've got a couple of things underway that have a lot of promise, but they could fail. So we'll let you know. But yeah, I mean, first off, the first engagement that we did was with the Open Data Kit project, which was out of the University of Washington. And they reflect a very kind of common, and actually it's different, but good. It was a little bit strange to me when I kind of came into this international development world, is that where do these projects often initiate? They initiate most of the time inside of NGOs and academic institutions.
What is an NGO?
A non-governmental organization.
Okay.
So big, I guess they don't have to be big, but nonprofits, global nonprofits. And so my first thought, I come more from the world of startups and VC, et cetera. And then you look at international development, and you're like, okay, so this is strange. Like, why are universities starting? Like, why is this, grassroots human rights organization in Tunisia, why are they the ones starting this software? It seems a little strange. And it isn't strange. And the reason is that for any kind of, piece of, substantive software to be built, it needs a big push of money, right? So in the kind of the VC world, we get that, right? Like there's a period of time where you're pouring the money in and it's not coming out, but you're building stuff. And at the end, you've built something fairly substantial. So then you'd say, like, okay, in the international development space, how does that work? What's the equivalent of it? So you're essentially building, nonprofit things. And so and I keep using that $3 million number, it's kind of a good number. A lot of the projects that we see are, kind of in that space to kind of get them up and moving. We've seen some that have 20 times that number of donated money into it. But then, of course, a lot of really tiny ones as well, as in the startup world. But the organizations that can accept these large grants, these very, very large grants, you have to have the capacity and the capability and even the legal status to be able to do that. And while it differs a bit, these large nonprofits and academic institutions are able to kind of take that money in. And so it's very, very common in our world. Actually, to be quite honest, like most of what I am doing is figuring out the long-term organizational home for these products. And so they'll start inside of a nonprofit, they'll start inside of a university. So back to, the example of ODK, it's been a very, very, successful open source project for the kind of like data collection in the international development space. It's, it's a well-known product, came out of the University of Washington. And, it wasn't horrible that it was in the University of Washington, but all organizations are like, you know what, we're really not in the software business, maybe we should look at we've incubated it, we've put all the initial energy into it and it's being used. Like the community is actually fairly robust. And so with them, we did our, what I was talking about, the Open-Sourcifying, of the product, coming in and making, going through the process of creating a community governance, going through the process of, making sure that all the licenses and, had conversations with all of those who'd kind of built consulting companies on top of it, making sure that they that their voices are heard inside the community, looking at the various forks and just creating a community process for how first the community can become very strong and then be able to essentially roll it out and spin it out of the University of Washington. So figuring out who would then replace the university as the fiscal sponsor, how would they be able to receive funds, how would those funds be able to be dispersed to the community. ODK in our world has some unique advantages, and that they have a very mature community of contributors. And so, we would say that was an example of how we could very quickly come in just over a period of a couple of months, create a very kind of robust standalone kind of project with its community, and then let it just thrive.
How did you get involved in this?
As I had said earlier, I owned a software company with offices in Africa and in the Middle East, and we were an outsourcing kind of software services company, building mostly for U.S.-based startups, but in that process had a significant number of very talented and good developers. And this the startup world craze, like the Silicon this and the Silicon that. So I happen to have teams in the Silicon Oasis of Jordan and in the Silicon Savannah of Kenya. And just ideas started flowing. Valley money started finding its way to Africa, which was really interesting, fun, and exciting. And then in a new way to kind of attack these kind of same social problems. So at that time, what I had is a whole bunch of developers. And so I retooled that company to essentially provide technical support to local startups while still doing the outsourcing side of things, which then got me kind of fully into what they call the impact investing space. So VC for social enterprises, and so that was kind of the world that I was living in when a colleague invited me to join this new organization that was attempting to do the same thing with open source projects. Ooh, that sounds like a challenge. In Africa, yay, fun. Like, that's going to be really, really interesting. And, I came in kind of overwhelmed, and I remain overwhelmed. But I think you can tell from, my tone in this podcast, also pretty excited because we can see a path forward. Like we can see places for some quick wins that make a huge difference. We also see some challenges that haven't been kind of cracked yet, but we can see how they could be. And we're also pretty kind of optimistic that the types of problems that we'll be solving, will also become a roadmap for the rest of the open source world of how they can, some creative and new ways that they can kind of address some of their sustainability challenges.
Are you essentially open sourcing the patterns that you're generating and making this a very public effort so that people can follow exactly how you're doing it and learn from that?
Yeah, we're doing our best. We have that in philosophy. We have our website, which people can find at osc.dial.community. And then we also have a public-facing Zulip, which kind of has all of our kind of plans and our participation. There's a sustainability guide that we're working on that we'll release as a publication later in this year, and hopefully that'll be pretty interesting.
Fantastic. How big is your team, or how big is this organization?
The organization is highly leveraged with externals. A lot of people participate, but yeah, we're about a 30-person organization. Those of us who are working, specifically on the open source software challenges, we got 7 people working on it. But we leverage with external consultants, etc. So even on this podcast, we can call out to say, like, if people are interested in this stuff, either in participating on the projects that we support or even consulting on them, we are building up a network of external consultants as well.
For those that might be interested in that, which I imagine quite a few will be, how do they get in? How do they get involved?
The best way is to go to the our website and kind of fill out the form. If they are a project that feels like the criteria is that, and you can stretch it a little bit, that they're projects that are focused on international development. focused on solving. The UN has coined a term that the whole world has signed on to, of the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs. And so that is an acronym and a word that we use a lot. And so things that are focused at solving the Sustainable Development Goals, it can apply for these. So we have these little grants that kind of happen all the time, which are I call them the Open-Sourcify them kind of things. So they're small, like $20,000-ish dollar grants, but even though that's a small amount of money, it comes with some kind of TA from our team. So we would come alongside the grant recipient. We do a little bit of kind of an audit of where they're at, provide some data statistics on kind of how they kind of benchmark against other projects. But then we also provide some direct in-kind consulting alongside those grants and figuring out legal licensing, community. We do some financial modeling, should they want it. Etc.
Before we wrap up, we're starting to come to the end of our time, but I do want to talk to you about your experience in developing business models for sustainability. I'd love to just hear your advice and hear your wisdom on that.
The very first thing that we do is we go through the process of identifying community, right? Communities at the beginning, and then organizational home. Like, who's your community? Who kind of owns this thing? Like, who's responsible? Who's ultimately responsible, both legally, let's call that the fiscal sponsor, but even in terms of vision. So we started to use the maintainer language for the one who holds the primary vision for the project, and the fiscal sponsor who kind of has the legal. And then we've added a third thing to it, which is just a catch-all for everything else, which is operational activities, organizational, blah, blah, blah. And so in our projects, if it is back to our healthcare example, if it's that healthcare product in Malawi, you've got to have somebody on the ground who's going and meeting hospitals and talking to them about it. So there's some non-code related things. And so first we kind of split those kind of three up, and we say, okay, who's responsible for each of those three things within the community? And we kind of solve them. Then from there, we say, okay, it needs to be sustained, right? So it can be sustained in probably, two different ways. One is if there is one primary organization and not a lot of others, they can build a business on top of it, or they can, if they're a nonprofit, they can continue to, get the grant funding that they need, right? So that's example one. Example two is where there is a diverse community. There's a lot of different, participants whose needs all have to be kind of thought through. And this plays out in other parts in the open source world. So like, let's say, the easiest way to build businesses on top of it are, consulting and hosting, right? So if you build a SaaS version of something, there you go. You got a business model. I think we're all struggling with that, because if you build a SaaS business model, do just you get to do it, or who is you? And can lots of people build that model, and can it become too fragmented? And so we look at all of those different considerations. And then from there, if we say like, okay, you actually have enough control to be able to build a business, and maybe you're one business among many who are building off of the same common core. Or maybe you're kind of the primary, like you're the only one in town, regardless. Let's start to walk through what are the different revenue streams that you can begin to generate. And so we start with SaaS. It can be a bit of a challenge because we work in low bandwidth environments. So we do think a little bit about, offline, online kinds of tech that is quickly not being used anymore. But we think about that kind of stuff. And then we talk about consulting. Is there a consulting model that you can bring on top of that? After that, we have a list of we call them revenue considerations. We have about 50 different things that you can think of, and that would include things like advertising, and it could. There's even things in there like product mix strategy, where you have one particular product that's really good at making money, and it is essentially your cash cow. But another one might lose money, but it's really good for your publicity and bringing people in. And if you put the two next to each other, you can do well. There's another really interesting model that we're starting to play around with a lot, in that a lot of this software is targeting people who can't pay, let's call it that. So some kind of a service, for the poor. So startups have a process for this. They call it freemium. But what does it look like kind of, for us? And so, we've got one project, which will not be named, that we're starting to work with, that is going to run two versions of their SaaS product. One, which is targeting poor countries, and it's going to be provided freely. And then they're building another version of it, which they will, release in the US and in Europe to generate revenue. So there's some things like that. But yeah, that's usually the starting point. And then the next thing that we do is, so we talk about the 50 different revenue streams, and then we take those revenue streams and we say, okay, let's choose like 5 to 10 that are really kind of reasonable, like that you have a good chance of being able to do. And then we have a working financial model where we can kind of, put those revenue streams in, put in all sorts of different kind of scenario assumptions, and then be able to kind of see what a steady state profit and loss might look like, either for an organization or for a group of organizations kind of together. So that's our process. That's how we do it. It's actually a pretty fun process, and we guide people through it fairly quickly. After that comes the really hard work of making it happen. And so we can participate in that, but it is long, and it does. Organizational change is hard, no matter kind of who you are. It becomes incredibly challenging in our open source world when we've delegated the ownership across a community with a lot of different interests. And if that community is not really kind of hitting on all cylinders, the projects can really, really struggle.
One of the things that I was thinking about while you were what you mentioned regarding companies that are essentially building alternate products for third world countries. I love that idea. I think that idea would also resonate really well with the audience. How would people get involved in that way? Let's say I had a company that's providing a service. I want to make it free for those third world countries to help support them, but I also still want to make money. How would you recommend they do that?
Yeah, I think the best way is because everyone on our team geeks out about this stuff, and you got to be honest, these are fun conversations to have.
Oh, I'm loving this conversation. I don't want it to end.
Yeah, the best way to get in contact with us is just through the website, which is the osc.dial.community, and just kind of send us a note, send us what you're interested in. And when we get thousands and thousands of requests, at that point we won't be able to respond to them, but right now, just a couple of weeks we can handle.
That'll be a good day, though, right?
That will be a good day.
Yeah, that's a good problem to have. Heath, you've been a fantastic guest and a huge supporter of open source, a huge supporter of the community, and somebody I'm very proud to have met. Where do people find you online?
Yeah, best places to find me. LinkedIn. I'm fairly traditional. My first and last name. I am on Twitter, but because I participate in so many broad and diverse communities, that can confuse people. But my handle is also my first and last name, Heath Arensen.
Fantastic.
One of the biggest pain points that I find as I talk to people about software is deployment. It's really interesting to have the conversations with people where it's, I don't want to deal with Docker. I don't want to deal with Kubernetes. I don't want to deal with setting up servers. I don't, all of these different things. And in a lot of ways, DevOps has gotten a lot easier. And in a lot of ways, DevOps has also kind of embraced a certain amount of culture around applications, the way we build them, the way we deploy them. And I've really felt for a long time that developers need to have the conversations with DevOps or adopt some form of DevOps so that they can take control of what they're doing and really understand when things go to production, what's going on, so that they can help debug the issues and fix the issues and find the issues when they go wrong and help streamline things and make things better and slicker and easier so that they'll more generally go right. So we started a podcast called Adventures in DevOps. And I pulled in one of the hosts from one of my favorite DevOps shows, Nell Shamrell Harrington from the Food Fight Show. And we got things rolling there. And so this is more or less a continuation of the Food Fight Show where we're talking about the things that go into DevOps. So if you're struggling with any of these operational type things, then definitely check out Adventures in DevOps. And you can find it at adventuresindevopspodcast.com.
So every week we end our podcast with what we call picks. And picks are when we want to share something that's been impactful for us, share something that makes us unique, something that we like, maybe something we purchased, anything like that. Now, I'll go ahead and share a couple of picks. First pick I'm going to share is a book that I actually started reading yesterday, and I'm already halfway through it. I'm devouring it. And the book is called The Alter Ego Effect, and that's written by Todd Herman. It's a fantastic book that it's so interesting because I think a lot of developers go through what they call imposter syndrome. A lot of entrepreneurs feel like failures even though they're not. And this book helps you recognize that, it helps you identify those negative thoughts and label them. And it kind of walks you through essentially a way to create an alter ego that you can tap into when you need to. And that alter ego actually empowers you to become more successful. So it's, again, I'm only halfway through the book, but I think it's a fantastic book. So it's alteregoeffect.com. And the second thing I'm going to pick, my son's behind me here on the couch playing this video game. And we actually played together. Last night we played together for 2 hours, just sitting there. It's called Golf Clash. And, I love golf as, actual golf, getting out there and golfing. But Golf Clash is so much fun, and normally I'm not a big fan of these types of games, but this one, for some reason, is just a magical game. So I'd like to pick that as well. Heath, what about you?
This week has been an interesting one because I've been really, really kind of obsessed with my grandfather's old Nikon cameras. And I don't know why I hadn't thought of it before, but I've started grabbing his old lenses and then putting them on some of my new digital bodies and kind of bringing them back to life. And, it meant a lot to me. My grandfather was, a photographer in Africa back in the 1950s and 60s. And, when I was growing up, I used to spend the afternoons in his darkroom with him. And when he passed away, he had left his camera collection to me and nothing else. And so the cameras have always meant a lot, but they've always just sat on the shelf. So this week, for the first time, I'm actually using them. And it just, I don't know, there's something just energetic that happens with a lens when it's in your hand. And the fact that a lens that was, from the 1950s is still just, able to create, just beautiful images is pretty cool. So that's what I'm doing this week.
Fantastic. Heath, again, thank you sincerely for being on this podcast. Thank you for your contributions and all the ways that you're doing, for shedding some light to the Digital Impact Alliance, the open source portion of that. We appreciate it. And so we'll wrap this up. We'll be back next week. And thank you all for listening. And also thank you to our sponsors for providing sponsorship on this. We appreciate it. Take care.
Thanks.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more.